ecological benefits of native plants. This is one of the essential components of why the native component to a landscape is so important in terms of including not only the flora, but also the fauna that comes along with it, which are the pollinators. Now, native plants, they provide food for wildlife and pollinators that include from hummingbirds to native bees to butterflies to moths to bats to all the cycle of communities that depend on the ecological and the evolutionary relationships that were formed over millions and millions of years. And that's the beauty of native plants, is that, through evolution, they have developed factors that help them protect themselves against fungus, against molds, against viruses, against all these components that affect not only human life, but animal life. And so because of that, they have these beneficial gifts that can provide to our community as humans in order to benefit in all our ailments of today. And now, they not only provide for the wildlife and human component, but they also will provide for the necessary stages of life. Now, let me explain a little bit about the necessary stages of life. I want to tell just a quick story about a bird that's very familiar or very important to me, which is the California cactus wren. This is a bird I actually did my master's thesis on, and it's a very important endemic bird to Southern California that has been reduced in its population. Now, this bird is dependent on insects. However, one thing that in the studies that have been done that has been shown is that insects, which are the pollinators, are not the only component that's important for the first stages of this bird's life. Let me explain. When an insectivorous bird, or many of our songbirds, birds that eat worms, birds that eat, little beetles and things of that sort, in the first few days of a baby bird's life, the chitin that's within the exoskeleton of the insect is actually too much for that baby to digest. And so what happens is that the mama and papa actually need another food set, another food to feed to their babies in the first 1, 2, 3 days of life. And that food are fruits. Now, without the relationships of the pollinators to the native plants, you would not have the fruits available to continue the life process of our insectivorous birds. So that relationship of having the value of fruits to be able to provide life to our native birds would not happen without the native pollinators. And that mutualism, or that necessary relationship together, is why having the native components to a landscape is very important. Now, just real quick, there's been studies that have been done that show, there's actually an entomologist, his name is Doug Tallamy. He actually showed that the native oak, it was able to house and to support 500 different species of caterpillar. 500. Whereas in many of our areas where oaks have been removed, they've been replaced with a non-native tree known as ginkgo. Popular tree, even here in the Los Angeles area. Now, that tree has been shown to only support 3 caterpillar species, as opposed to the 500 species of one simple native tree. Now, that support system provides for a whole slew of different compounds of nutrition, different mutualistic relationships, different symbiotic relationships that provide for the cycle of how the system was set up here to process. And that's the key, is the cycle that occurs when native pollinators and native plants are utilized for a native landscape. Now, another similar study where they found that the diversity and abundance of caterpillars and birds, so they're looking both at the pollinator component and at the predator or the bird component, and how in native landscapes, it was significantly higher in population diversity as well as the biodiversity within these native landscapes as opposed to non-native landscapes, just the standard imported plant landscape. Those components, unfortunately, don't provide the support system for many of our pollinator species. And because of that, that's the detriment to having non-native plants involved in a landscape, because they will not support the native fauna of the area. Now, one simple study actually found that songbirds on average, and this is included with the cactus wren that I spoke about earlier, that over 6,000 caterpillars are needed just to raise one brood of chicks. So to need 6,000, and when you then plant a tree that only provides 3 different species, whereas you can plant a tree, a native tree, that provides over 500 species. You're seeing how the relationships and the cycles are necessary in order to make that cycle happen. And that's the main key, the main takeaway is that it's already been set up for us. We already have these relationships set in place. And so by disregarding those relationships and planting just a non-native flora of different landscape plants just for their look rather than for their ecological value, you're missing out on a whole slew of other benefits that come when you can bring the native animals and wildlife to the area. Now, the nuts, the seeds, the fruits of native plants, it is amazing what essential elements and nutrients that they provide, not only to wildlife, but coming from an indigenous perspective, also to people. That's why so many of our plants were used for medicine. The food was the medicine, and these essential elements of amino acids, enzymes, monoterpenoids, flavonoids, sesquiterpenes, all of these components that science has names for, all have a specific purpose. And when we remove that purpose by removing the native plants and removing the native pollinators, you are not getting any benefits. And that's the idea behind why we want to incorporate the plants that were already here, that were already set up within, and here's another scientific word, the geomorphology of our landscape. Now, what does that mean, geomorphology? Geomorphology is actually how the landscape works in these cycles. When you have a river that goes through a landmass and creates a little canyon, that canyon now has different soils that it's supported by. It has different light aspects that it's supported by. It has all these elements that help the native plants and pollinators survive and grow. When you switch from the native components to a non-native layering of plants, this then reduces and even eliminates that geomorphological component of our landscape. And that component is actually the basis for what supports our plants and animals. So when you take out just one part of this cycle that has occurred here over millions of years, according to science, then you have reduced the support that the plants give to the diversity and to the ecological balance of a region, and also to the survival of specific species. Just give you one other little story about how through evolution these relationships have occurred. The yucca. Oh my goodness. Yucca is one plant that is so important to the cultural component of Southern California, as well as probably throughout the Southwest and all the way where yucca exists. Actually, yucca exists all over the world. And it's quite interesting that yucca only has one pollinator. And this pollinator, known as the yucca moth, it's a crazy little activity that this yucca moth does, because the yucca moth is dependent on the plant and the plant is dependent on the moth. And literally, there's no other alternative. It's the moth and the plant. And here's how. When the yucca moth actually emerges from the soil and starts the new life cycle, the female will go into one of the plants and it'll grab some of the pollen. Then it puts the pollen in its little antennae and creates a little ball of pollen. It's sticky pollen. And it goes then, flies off to another plant, goes into that plant and goes to the ovary. And in the ovary, it then lays its eggs, because that's where the seeds are going to develop from, because the seeds are going to be the food for the next generation. Well, as it goes into the ovary, it lays its eggs, then it goes into the stamen where the style is, and it'll stick that pollen into there, making sure that those seeds are now pollinated so that it can produce food for the eggs that it just laid. But then it goes one step further. Then it lays a pheromone onto that flower so that other yucca moths, when they come, they know, oh, somebody's already been here and laid eggs. Because if a whole bunch of yucca moths end up laying their eggs in one flower, they're going to overconsume that flower. So through the evolutionary process, they know that, oh, this one has too much. I got to go to another one and lay my eggs in that one, so that there's a balance. These sort of systems that happen, we can't recreate that. And when we put in non-native plants into areas, those systems are all messed up. They all get broken because that system is reliant upon each other. And when you remove any part of that system or cycle, that then destroys the necessary mutualism or the symbiosis. The one needs the other, and they can't survive without each other. That's destroyed. So when we remove the relationship of the pollinator with the plant, we are removing the values that it wants to provide to us as a community on the landscape. And by understanding these relationships, we can understand how to best provide so that, guess what? We get the values as the human. And that's literally what these plants want to do. They're put here, as my uncle always said, our chief, that these plants are providing us gifts. And that's all they're trying to do. And yet, we just kind of forget that these gifts are available. And we replace them with other components that then remove those gifts from our access. So, understanding the ecological benefits and the ecological relationships that have already been created on our land is essential to getting values and getting benefits for not only today's community, but also tomorrow.